Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. As difficult as it might be to believe, I am not Edgar Allan Poe. It's just me, Chris, from the Poe Museum. But over the, say, 174 years since Edgar Allan Poe's death, countless actual actors have performed as Poe on stage and screen. So tonight, we're going to take a look back at some of the best and worst Poe-formances in tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. This is the cape that actor Norman George wore when he performed as Edgar Allan Poe in his one-man stage show, which People magazine commented that if reincarnation is possible, then Norman George is Poe. Now, why did he have a cape? Because the contemporary descriptions say that Poe often wore a Spanish cloak instead of an overcoat. Another thing you might not know is off in the summer, instead of wearing that dark top hat, he wore a Panama hat and dressed in a white linen suit. Or what about that famous Poe mustache? He didn't grow that until about 4 years before he died, so most people who knew him wouldn't have known him with that mustache. And these are the kind of little physical details that actors have to learn when they put together their performances, their interpretations of Poe. Now, in addition to this, actors like Norman George also had to figure out what Poe sounded like, how he moved, how he carried himself. These are the kind of details that we can't see because we don't have video or audio recordings of Poe. So once again, we have to consult the contemporary descriptions to get the best approximation we can of what it would have been like to meet Edgar Allan Poe in person. And that's the real challenge faced by Poe actors over the years. Now, a lot of actors have tried to portray Poe on stage and screen. For today's Curator's Crypt, we're just going to focus on the 13 best or worst Poe performances on screen. Just for the sake of brevity, we can't list all of the Poe performances, and we're going to exclude performances are on stage. So that means we have to leave out a lot of great ones like Norman George, David Kelts, John Astin, Paul Day Clemens, Scott Craig Jones. We just can't get to all those on this list. We're going to focus on the ones that have appeared on films or television shows that you're going to be able to see somewhere, streaming or otherwise. So let's start out with the first Poe performance on screen. Way back in the 1909 D.W. Griffith film, Edgar Allan Poe. You can't hear the way I said that, but I pronounced it A-L-L-E-N because they actually misspelled Poe's name on the title. The actor here is Herbert Yost. The film is about Poe trying to write The Raven so he can get enough medicine for his dying wife, Virginia. But when Poe gets back from finally selling the poem, Virginia dies anyway. And it's tragic, a lot of wailing and crying. And today we can look back on this performance as a bit stylized and over the top, but in being the first to bring Poe to the screen, Yost set the standard for those to follow. And he didn't have to sound like Poe because it's a silent film. As far as looking like Poe is concerned, I'll give him a 3 Poes out of 5 because he at least looks like a caricature of Poe. And that's something. And for our next Poe-former, we'll go to 1915 to the film The Raven, starring Henry Walthall. Once again, it's sort of a Poe biopic without all that pesky historical accuracy and everything. At the time, people were saying that if reincarnation were possible, then Walthall is Poe. Once again, we have to cut his acting some slack because it's a silent film, so the acting is going to be a little bit exaggerated to begin with. But as far as looking like Poe, I'll give him a 3 Poes out of 5 once again, because he kind of looks like Poe. He does a decent job. And we have to wait another 3 decades for another major Poe performance. This time, it's The Loves of Edgar Allan Poe from 1942, starring John Shepherd. And it's a typical Poe-mance story where Poe meets the loves of his life like Virginia and Elmira Shelton. But of course, Virginia dies tragically, so spoiler alert. And it's just kind of a sappy movie. And for his part, John Shepherd, he's got sound, but he really doesn't try to do the accent too well. He doesn't even put on a mustache for the part at the end where Poe would have had a mustache. And his acting's a little bit wooden, so I'm going to give him 2.5 Poes. Now let's go for another decade for somebody who put a little bit more effort into his performance. That's Joseph Cotten from the 1951 film The Man with the Cloak. Spoiler alert, the man in the cloak is Edgar Allan Poe. And this is a mystery story we're really not supposed to know until the end that it is Poe, but we figure it out. And you might recognize Joseph Cotten as one of the actors from Citizen Kane, but you might not know that he actually grew up 30 miles south of Richmond down in Petersburg, Virginia. So he's actually from the same area, generally speaking, where Edgar Allan Poe grew up. And he still doesn't look much like Poe, but I like that he finally got to solve a mystery instead of just falling in love and weeping like he does in those previous films. So I'll give him 3.5 Poes. Now it's time to enter the disco era. The specter of Edgar Allan Poe is very much a product of its time, an age of decadence and disco. Robert Walker portrays Poe, who has to break into an asylum to rescue his lady love. Walker is appropriately moody and Poe-esque, but he just doesn't look a whole lot like Poe, and his hairstyle is more 1980s skateboarder. So I'm going to give him 2 Poes. Now, our next one is a little bit of a stretch. This is Poe from an episode of the sitcom Sabrina the Teenage Witch. And the characters use this sort of magic to bring Poe to dinner at their house. And yeah, the jokes mostly fall flat, but this Poe is portrayed by a Poe relative, Edgar Allan Poe IV. Now I know what you're thinking. This can't be Edgar Allan Poe IV because Edgar Allan Poe didn't have any kids, so there couldn't be an Edgar Allan Poe IV. But actually, after our Edgar Allan Poe the poet got famous, other Poes started naming their sons Edgar Allan. So there are a bunch of Edgar Allan Poes out there. One was a judge, one was a football player, and there's even an Edgar Allan Poe house in North Carolina that's a completely different Edgar Allan Poe than our Edgar Allan Poe. So, yeah, Edgar Allan Poe IV could be related to our Edgar Allan Poe. He's just not a direct descendant of our Edgar Allan Poe. He's just a different Edgar Allan Poe. But anyway, he goes to her house for a dinner party, and it turns out that Poe is tired of reading melancholy poetry and scary stories, and he wants to write inspirational poems. Yeah, it's not very funny, but that's kind of the punchline of the whole show. So at least Poe and Sabrina the Teenage Witch he settled with a bad script, but he did kind of capture the Poe look. And he does have a presence. He didn't really have the depth of characterization, but the script really didn't give him the opportunity. So just judging by what we have, I'll give him 3 Poes. And our next Poe is Mark Redfield from the 2006 film, The Death of Poe. I'll bet you'll never guess what that film's about. And he's kind of a Poe specialist. He's done a lot of radio shows where he's interpreted Poe's stories, so he's really got inside the mind of Poe, captured that mixture of hopelessness and dignity. just trying to hold himself together in those final days in Baltimore where he's just struggling to get his magazine off the ground until he meets his untimely end. And I think he's pretty good in this. So I give him 3.5 Poes. And speaking to people who really know their Poe, next up is Jeffrey Combs from the Showtime Masters of Horror episode The Black Cat, directed by Stuart Gordon, the same guy who directed Reanimator and, of course, the Poe movie The Pit and the Pendulum. And Jeffrey Combs really got into his character. He even got a prosthetic nose piece so he could have the Poe nose. And essentially the plot is the story The Black Cat mixed with Poe's life. So Poe and his wife become the husband and wife in the story, and he knocks it out of the park. This is Jeffrey Combs trying to become one with Poe, and afterwards he started doing a solo stage play as Poe. And he was one who really gave the Poe characterization a lot of the depth that previous actors hadn't given it. He started to see Poe as a more well-rounded, complete character instead of just a one-dimensional caricature. I give him 4.5 Poes. Why not 5 Poes? Because I want to give him something to strive for. You can always do better. And up next, John Cusack in the 2012 film The Raven. And what Cusack contributed was he brought the character a darkness mixed with humor, which is something he really does in a lot of his roles, going all the way back to Better Off Dead or Grosse Pointe Blank. Cusack can play both sides. And he made this sort of a very active Poe who's running around chasing the villain, but it's a grittier, darker Poe than we're used to seeing. That having been said, he's too tall for the role. He can't help it. He can't help how tall he is. Maybe they could have just gotten taller actors so he'd seem shorter, so he'd seem Poe's height. And the goatee really didn't work. But I think Cusack did the most with what they gave him. So I'm going to say 4 Poes out of 5. And up next, this is cheating a little bit, but Dennis O'Hare portrayed Poe in the reenactments from the PBS American Masters special Edgar Allan Poe Buried Alive. Now, you might not recognize Dennis O'Hare because he's played pretty much a completely different character in just about every season of American Horror Stories, so you might not even realize you're seeing the same actor from one season to the next. And with his portrayal, he really gets into the character and he imbues him with a sense of dignity and grace that we don't often see in interpretations of Poe on screen. And he doesn't even try to do the accent, but you can forgive him that. And also, he's too old for the role, but Poe looked old for his years, so you can kind of let that slide. So I'm going to give him 4 Poes out of 5. It's a great portrayal. Now, this next one, the number 11, isn't necessarily a portrayal of Poe so much as a portrayal of an AI hologram portrayal of Poe in the distant future. It's Chris Connor from the series Altered Carbon. Now, that having been said, his Poe looks more Poe-esque than most of the Poe-formers out there. And plus, he's a bad gambler, which is reference to Poe losing a lot of money gambling while he was at college. But it's difficult to judge this one. But if he were to play Poe and not an AI simulation of Poe, he would get 4 Poes from me. But since he's not technically portraying Poe, I'll have to give his 4 Poes to Poe's ghost on South Park. Next up in our 12th spot, Nick Kroll portrayed Poe on Dickinson.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, Poe and Death are riding around in a carriage, and they give Emily Dickinson a ride with them. And Nick Kroll, you might know from his comedy, and he plays a pretty funny interpretation of Poe. He has a lot of fun with the role. It's not a really long part, but He's a standout among Poe-formers out there, so I'll give him 3.5 Poes. Now, the most recent Poe-formance has got to be Harry Melling as the 21 or 22-year-old West Point cadet Poe in the film The Pale Blue Eye. And playing a younger Poe than the other ones, he gets rid of the mustache and he really interprets his character in a different way. He portrays him as sort of that weird kid who's got a dark past, but a quirky sense of humor. And it really fits with the way people describe Poe as being this sort of weird guy, this outsider, doesn't quite fit in. And for that reason, I give him 4 Poes out of 5. I think overall did a good job. He overdid the accent a little bit. And he doesn't look too much like Poe. Maybe from here up he looks like Poe, and from here down he doesn't. But that's going to work. So that's 13 Poe-formances from the silver screen. Do you agree with our list? Who do you think was the best Poe-former? Did we leave anybody out? Let us know down in the comments. Keeping in mind that if we add any more to the list, it won't be 13 anymore, so it won't be creepy. But if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces like Norman George's Poe cape, why not contribute to the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.